Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this presentation, Preparing for the MCAT Exam, What You Need to Know. Today's presentation will be a panel discussion where you'll learn and hear advice from a current MD-PhD student and two pre-health advisors about good ways to think about studying for and preparing for test day. Regardless of whether you're taking the exam this year or planning for the future, this information you'll hear today will help you as you approach your preparation for this exam. So my name is Lauren Siegel, and I'm the Senior Communications Specialist for the MCAT team at the Association of American Medical Colleges, or AAMC, and I will be moderating today's panel presentation. I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists today. Carol Baffy-Dugan, Associate Dean of Undergraduate Advising and Director of Health Professions at Tufts University. Francisco Castellan, who is the Pre-Health Advising Manager at Georgia Institute of Technology, and Daquan Johnson, who's a first-year MD-PhD student in the MST program at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. For today's agenda, we'll first start off with a very brief, high-level overview of the MCAT exam to set the stage for our discussion. Then we will move on to the discussion with our panelists, and at the end, there'll be enough time for you, the audience, to ask our panelists your questions. Please feel free to begin submitting your questions throughout the presentation, but we'll get to them at the end. So with that, let's dive right in. So MCAT stands for the Medical College Admission Test, and it's created and administered by the AAMC. The MCAT exam is a standardized, multiple-choice test that's been part of the medical school admissions process for over 90 years. Almost all U.S. and Canadian medical schools require applicants to their programs to submit recent MCAT scores as part of their applications. The MCAT exam tests you on the concepts and skills medical school faculty, medical students, residents, and physicians have identified as key prerequisites for incoming students that they need to know on day one of medical school. The exam is taken on a computer, and the purpose of it is to assess your problem-solving, critical thinking, and your knowledge of the natural, behavioral, and social sciences concepts and skills, all necessary to the study and practice of medicine. As you listen to today's presentation, as well as throughout your preparation, it's important to keep in mind that this exam is just one piece of your overall application to medical school, and one piece of many that admissions committees use to evaluate your readiness for success in their programs. So the MCAT includes 4 sections. Again, each of the questions on the exam is multiple choice. There are 2 sections in the natural sciences. There's a section in the behavioral and social sciences. And finally, there's a section that tests you on your critical analysis and reasoning skills. The concepts tested in each of these sections are taught at most undergraduate institutions in introductory biology, physics, psychology, sociology, general and organic chemistry, as well as first semester biochemistry. Please keep in mind that undergraduate coursework varies by institution, so we encourage you to speak with a pre-health advisor or even a faculty member at your school to help you with course selection. So let's talk just briefly about how each of these sections are organized. We'll look at 3 sections first, the 2 in the natural sciences and the behavioral and social sciences section, because they're all organized the same way. As you can see from the image on the screen, these 3 sections are organized into what are called foundational concepts. Foundational concepts is just another way of saying the big ideas in the sciences. There are 10 total foundational concepts that make up these 3 sections, and within each foundational concept there are content categories, and those are just the topics and subtopics that you need to know in order to really understand those big ideas. And an important aspect of these 3 sections is how you demonstrate the ability to apply knowledge. The MCAT exam asks you to combine your scientific knowledge from multiple different disciplines with your scientific inquiry and reasoning skills, which are all listed on the screen. This means that the exam asks questions that ask you to reason about information presented, analyze and evaluate data, identify relationships between concepts or variables, draw conclusions, determine and use mathematical equations, and make predictions. These are just a few examples of the skills you'll need to use in combination with your content knowledge. The last section of the exam that we need to cover is the critical analysis and reasoning skills section. This section is very similar to other comprehension and reasoning tests that you've had throughout your academic careers. It includes passages and questions that test your ability to comprehend and analyze what you read. The passages that you'll be presented with pull from the humanities and social sciences disciplines, emphasizing philosophy, ethics, population health, and the studies of diverse cultures. This section doesn't require any specific content or disciplinary knowledge. All the information that you need is provided in the passages and the questions themselves. This chart shows you what test day will look like. This shows you the order in which the sections on the exam will appear, the number of questions per section, and the time allotted for each. As you will see, the total testing time for the exam is 6 hours and 15 minutes. This, however, doesn't include other test day related activities such as checking in, signing your examinee agreement, walking through the instructional tutorial, or completing the survey at the end. All told, the exam is about 7.5 hours. Please note that the day also includes 2 10-minute breaks and 1 30-minute mid-exam break. These breaks are optional and you can move from one section to the next without taking them, but you're not allowed to leave the testing center. So we encourage you to bring your own food and drinks with you. Please note, if you're somebody who is approved with additional testing time as an accommodation, you'll sit for the exam over the course of 2 days. And finally, after you take the exam, you'll get your scores 30 to 35 days after you test. You'll receive a total of 5 scores, which will be accessed through the online MCAT score reporting system. The first 4 scores you'll receive will be for your individual section scores. These sections have a scale that ranges from 118 to 132, and then these scores will then be added together to create your total score, and the total score ranges from 472 to 528. So with that, let's move on to the part of the presentation that you're all here for and most interested in. I first want to start off by thanking our 3 panelists, Carol, Francisco, and Daquan, for participating in today's presentation. It's so great to have you here today. Welcome. So,
thank you so much.
Great. So let's just dive right in and get started. And let's begin with a question first for Daquan. So as you know, and as the audience now knows, the MCAT exam is a long test, and there's a lot of content that you'll need to know. So it's probably very easy to think that the exam is just something you have to get through. But now that you're a current medical student and you've had some time to reflect, what has preparing for the MCAT exam taught you, or how has it better prepared you for entering medical school?
Okay, so I have 3 main points for that. Hi, everyone. So the first thing is that preparing for such a big exam requires a little bit more of consistency and sticking to a schedule, one thing you need as a medical student because you're given so much information. So being consistent and sticking to a schedule is very key for success. The second key point is just being responsible for your own education. So you're given materials, you're given information, but being able to process it because we all are coming from different institutions. And as Lauren said, that all of our courses may be slightly different, but we're all given a very similar exam. So knowing how to take the information that you've learned so far, process it, and actually apply it to a new situation is super important. The last thing is that taking this test is super important, not because it'll make you a great doctor, but because research and statistics show that if you do really well on the MCAT exam, you'll do better on the other standardized exams that come later in your medical career, which is your STEP and your certification exams. So it's really important you learn that it won't affect you as a practicing clinician, but it will be the gateway between you becoming a clinician at all. So it's best to make sure you get these skills down now so you won't struggle too much in the future.
That's great. Thank you, Daquan. Francisco and Carol, from your perspective, what advice would you give a student who's just starting to prepare for the exam and maybe doesn't know where to begin? Is there anything you wish to impress upon them? And then I know a lot of students already have this question probably in mind, but how long would you recommend a student actually prepare for the exam? And Francisco or Carol, feel free to start.
Well,
Carol,
this is Carol. I think I want to start with kudos because all of you on this webinar today have already taken the first important step in preparing for the MCAT, and that's just getting a sense of what this exam is about and starting your planning about how to prepare for it. Earlier today in the virtual fair, students were asking if they should be starting 9 months ahead of time or 12 months ahead of time. And I would say the answer is no in some sense and yes in other sense. It's never too early to have an idea of what this test tests. What the topics are, how it's broken up. But probably most students will do somewhere between 4 or 5 months of organized, planful study, like Daquan said, piece by piece, to get themselves ready for test day. So that would happen right before the test, 4 or 5 months before. But starting now with this webinar is a great start. Francisco?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you so much, Carol. I think the first thing that a student needs to do is to evaluate what is the availability they're going to have and the timeline that they're putting together. Oftentimes I see students not being aware of the demand of the test, and so therefore they think that they'll be able to squeeze it in while they're also doing a full course load of courses. And so talking with your pre-health advisor is a good opportunity to kind of evaluate, is it a good time frame to look at. The best way that I can kind of frame it for students is 2 to 3 months is typically what I see, which is about the equivalent almost of a semester. And to put it into terms that usually can be a little bit more understandable into where they're currently at is if you think of a 4-credit course with lab and lecture, so the time that you spend in class, the time that you spend in lab, and the time that you spend outside of class with lab reports and studying, that's about the amount of time that you want to commit to the MCAT. So again, thinking about it from that perspective and your course load, adding an additional 4-credit course on top of that, would that be manageable for you?
Francisco, I think that's a great analogy. I agree. Comparing it to a course like that makes good sense.
That's great. I do want to mention that the AAMC also has a resource to help students develop a study plan. So part of that study plan is really taking the time to fully understand what actually goes into the MCAT exam, what's tested, all the pieces that go into it. So that really just complements what you've heard from Daquan, Francisco, and Carol. So switching gears just a little bit, let's talk about developing study habits and skills. Daquan, would you first just start off by speaking a little bit to how you prepared for test day, and then what study habits or skills did you find to be most helpful or effective during that process?
Okay. So the first part I want to preface with is like Francisco and Carol were saying, that the amount of time you study will vary. So I had friends who studied for an entire year. I had friends who studied for a month, for 2 to 3 months. So you have to know yourself and know how much time and how much you can actually devote to studying and what you need based on your previous performance in your courses. But for me personally, it took me about 8 months to study just because I tend to stay very busy. And I started the summer before the following January that I took the exam. And so the way I broke it up was that during my summer, since I was also doing a summer internship, I took the latter half of my day, studied for 4 hours every day during the weekdays, and then studied on the weekends about 6 hours per day. And I think the most important thing that was super helpful in terms of devising a plan was that my first thing I did when I was preparing for the MCAT was I bought a unscored practice exam from the AAMC, and I took that as my diagnostic exam to figure out which sections am I really strong in, which sections am I really poor in, and I literally went through for the next 4 or 5 days after taking that diagnostic exam and just going through question by question, trying to figure out which topics I need to go back and review. So that way I had a good idea in terms of what are my weak points, focus on those first, and then as I move forward and progress, I can work on and brush up my stronger points a little bit later, closer to the exam. And so that's the way how I kind of started with the diagnostic exam, decided what I need to focus on first. I used some outside resources, including like the Kaplan book series. And so I went through all those topics that were related to my weak points for my diagnostic exam over the course of that summer, my fall semester, and the few weeks following up to my exam. And so I think the most helpful, most effective thing that I did was that I set out a certain amount of time every single day, at the same time every single day, so that I can study. And because that consistency makes it a lot easier to convince yourself to do it, because eventually over 8 months, it's a long period of time, you get a little bit bored, you get a little bit tired, but because it becomes a habit, it's a lot easier to keep up with. And that habit's super important even in medical school, because you have to be consistent every single day with the information. Otherwise, you fall behind and it's next to impossible to catch up. So I think doing that very early for my MCAT prep was really good in terms of just like having that habit ready when I started medical school.
That's great. Time management is definitely important. Francisco and Carol, in a similar vein, what do you recommend for students to be doing before they even begin preparing for the MCAT exam to develop good or better study habits and skills to help them as they prepare for the exam? Francisco, would you like to start?
Yes, happy to do so. I guess one of the things that I would encourage them is to begin evaluating what is their study style and what is their learning style and what are the things that can help them. There's going to be a lot of resources that's going to help them with a test prep, and usually identifying what works best with their style is critical because some students learn better more visually, others can memorize a little bit better, and so again, identifying what are their strengths and weaknesses so they can incorporate those different styles and identify resources that can work better with their learning style. Usually that's one of the biggest hurdles that I think students will hit that I work with because they approach it the same way that they did with the ACT or SAT, and the MCAT is a whole different ball game, and so the better they are at learning what kind of style they have, they're going to be able to identify the resources that best fit their style.
Yeah, I concur with what Francisco said, and also I don't want everybody to be nervous when they heard how much time Daquan put into it. Remember Daquan's first sentence. You need to figure out what works for you and what approach you're going to need to take to be successful. So it's going to be different for each of you listening. I would imagine that most of you, having taken at least some of your pre-med science classes, are already developing good study skills. You're learning about how you learn and what works best for you. You're learning how to be organized, manage your time, set up a schedule, be conscientious. So you take all of those lessons and you just ramp it up a little bit when it comes to preparing for the MCAT, but I don't think it's something that's going to be totally different from the approach you took to your rigorous science courses to prepare.
That's great. Certainly we like to impress on students that there isn't a right or wrong way to prepare for test day, and so I really appreciate all of your comments on developing good study skills and habits. Moving on to another idea about, in the similar vein of developing good study habits and skills, it can also be very helpful to have a support system. And I was wondering, Daquan, did you seek any mentors or have any additional support when you were preparing for test day?
Yeah, so I was in a STEM program that's specifically like geared towards producing diverse research scientists and physician scientists. So I had the benefit of having a lot of older students who were going in the same vein as me, who've taken the MCAT in the past, who impressed upon the idea of consistency and making sure you are building that into your study schedule. But I think one of the hard parts was that I was kind of at that part where the MCAT just transitioned over, so I didn't have too many people to pull from for that test experience. So I wound up just pulling a lot more information from the AAMC website, and then from what I got from the information from taking the unscored practice exam to get a kind of flavor and a sense of what the exam will look like and how to start tailoring my study skills, tailoring my study schedule.
Great. Carol or Francisco, are there support systems that you would recommend that students have or seek out when preparing for test day? And for those that may not have access to these types of support systems or may not know that they're available, what do you recommend? Carol, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah. So we've already made mention of some of the resources that are available, and just so all of you listeners know, Francisco and I are not here to sell the AAMC products. However, I think both of us as advisors often refer our students to all of the resources that the AAMC makes available to students, some for free, some for a very low cost, and anybody can have access to those online. I'm thinking of people support systems, however, and I will often talk to my students about having a study partner or a study buddy. It needs to be the right kind of person. It needs to be someone who's going to share your goals and not be in a competition with you. But in the same way that if you run with a friend, you're tending to run a little further. If you study with a friend, it might keep you motivated. And I have quite a number of students who will have a study buddy for the MCAT, and they find that to be a helpful thing.
Thank you, Carol. I think I would also add to the picture is that with technology nowadays, there's a lot of great support systems online. There's a lot of mentoring programs that have launched in the last few years. And so it's a great place to be connected to a community and find other individuals that may be out there also going through the same process. And so building a support system that way that share tips, share resources in a way that you're able to check in with each other and just answer questions. Now we have to think about preparing for the test is not just about memorization, but again, trying to get this knowledge in a more deeper way and be able to apply it in a very unique way. And so again, as Carol mentioned, study buddies or study groups can be a way that as you're not only learning from each other, but teaching each other can help you understand the material a little bit more in depth and learn how to apply it. So again, being creative with the resources that you do have, and then trying to use any communities that you can connect to online.
That's great. Carol and Francisco, if a student doesn't know if they have a pre-health advisor or know of an advisor on their campus, do you have any suggestions of where they might go to seek that kind of formal advice potentially?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that.
Yeah, go ahead, Francisco.
So both Carol and I are part of an organization called the National Association for Advisors in the Health Professions, or NAAHP, or NAAHP. And on that site, there is a section for students, and there'll be a tab right there in the middle on the top where they're able to actually identify if there is a pre-health advisor that's a member of our organization, and be able to identify who that person is. If their school isn't listed, there is an opportunity to send an email through this website to identify an advisor that has volunteered their time to work with students that don't have advisors at their institution. So this is a free resource available to everybody. And then again, there are a lot of great programs out there that have established nonprofit organizations. Again, you should be looking for a resource that ideally you don't have to pay for. Again, if you're paying for something, that means they better deliver on their promises or the fees, what they're charging you. But in essence, looking at working with advisors both on your campus and throughout the country is a good way to connect with not just understanding the preparation for the MCAT, but other pre-health advice in general.
That's great. And I do want to remind folks listening today that we actually have pre-health advisors who are chatting, and they would love to talk with you as well if you have other questions for them. So just a little plug for that booth. Moving on, I know we're getting some questions about resources specifically. So let's start with Daquan about what resources you found to be most helpful when you were preparing.
So so when I was studying for the MCAT, again, like I said before, when I started, it was around the time just when the switch happened, so there wasn't a lot of resources out there other than what the AAMC put out. So that's really what I was limited to, mostly with the AAMC information, and then also the Kaplan book series that was also out at the time. So those were the two main resources I relied heavily on when I was studying and preparing for the exam.
Great. And as Carol and Francisco mentioned, they're not here to sell any types of resources, so we're just putting that out there. But are there resources that you, Carol or Francisco, recommend that students use when they're preparing for test day? I know you mentioned some of the AAMC resources, but are there any other resources out there that you think would be helpful for students to know about?
Well, I have a panel of students every year talking about how they prepared for the MCAT so that students coming up the following year can just benefit. And there's some common denominators that come through every year when we do this panel. One is that everyone says don't just use one type of resource or one source of support or material. So use the AAMC material, but maybe, Daquan mentioned the Kaplan books. There are commercial products out there and commercial review courses. There's a hardcover series called the Berkeley Review. There are other online resources. So mix them up. Don't use all the same thing. The other common denominator that every single student has ever said to me, as part of their preparation, they use some of the wonderful resources on the Khan Academy that I know you can link to from the AAMC MCAT website, or you can Google it on your own. But there's a huge amount of information on the Khan Academy on all kinds of topics covered on the MCAT, and all of my students use that as part of their preparation, and it's free.
And then I would also add to highlight that there is a great section within the AAMC website that it includes the profiles of close to 30 or more students outlining their approach to preparing, what tips they use, what pitfalls they had, what were strategies were common tests that they took. And that has been a great resource for me as an advisor to be an example for my students that they can approach it in so many different ways, and they'll see the resources, all the different resources that other students suggest, and just to really show that there isn't one exact way of doing it. And so again, identifying what are the things that are going to be available to them and a better fit for them.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Certainly those profiles that you were talking about, Francisco, for students listening, if you go to aamc.org/MCAT prep, you'll find those profiles, and you'll actually recognize one of the students listed there. Daquan was profiled for us, and you can actually read his story to complement this discussion as well. So thank you so much for pointing that out, Francisco. That's a great resource that we love to share with students. So we are just trucking right along, and we're coming down to our final thoughts from our presenters, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Daquan, reflecting on your own preparation and knowing what you know now, is there anything that you might have done differently when you were preparing for test day?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I think every person would tend to say that, just because you always, hindsight's 20/20. I think one of the biggest things to keep in mind is that a lot of pre-med majors tend to be hardcore STEM majors, so whether or not it's biology, biochemistry, chemistry, and we tend to get into our own little bubble, in our own little zone. And one of the things that Lauren pointed out is that when we have the critical analysis and reason, like critical thinking, the CARS section of the exam, we don't have to have any specific content knowledge, but it's about reading things in the humanities. And I think one of the things that as science majors we tend to forget is to read for fun. And I think the more you do, the earlier you do that, and the sooner you start doing that, so reading, whether or not you like keeping up with current stories and current news and politics, reading the newspapers, reading blogs, reading fiction, nonfiction, it'll make that section so much easier. Because it's a lot more difficult to strengthen a skill like that than it is to learn the Krebs cycle for the biology portion. So I think that's something that you can enjoy a part of the study process where you're just reading for fun and building that critical thinking, that critical analysis aspect of reading things outside of science, not just a textbook or a scientific paper. And I think had I started that a little bit sooner, as I just started as a freshman, that would have made life so much easier. We even started like a year before. It would have made things a lot easier for the CARS section. I think the other thing that I would have done more was just took more practice exams, just because, again, you don't normally take 6-hour exams. And so you have to get used to the physical demand of that exam as well as the mental demand. And so the more you get used to that consistency and that feeling of what it is to get through that exam, the less your nerves will be on the day of the exam, because you're used to doing it like the exam itself. And two, it reduces the nerves you have and the nervousness you'll have on the exam. And I think you'll tend to perform a little bit better when you're less nervous.
That's great. Carol and Francisco, is there one key takeaway you'd like every student to know about or when they're preparing for the exam? Final thought? Carol?
Well, I guess what I would say is it feels very overwhelming to think about everything you need to know for the exam and how long the exam is going to be. But I would say break it up in little pieces. Focus on one thing at a time. Have your schedule. You're going to do these topics. You're going to do these sample questions. You're going to do some CARS passages. Focus on each step of the way so that the whole thing doesn't seem so overwhelming. I think it's more manageable that way.
Great.
And I would also add then to the picture that, they have to approach this as, you'll hear the analogy often of running a marathon. You have to train, you have to prepare yourself. I've seen some of the questions posted about, how do you prepare for the long time and getting tired all the way through. And again, understanding even your physical preparation, if you tend to, get tired after, you're doing a few practice tests, you start seeing that your energy drops down, then making sure that you do have some food with you at the for a snack or for lunch while you're there. Again, you have to look at the bigger picture of how you're training for this bigger task at hand. And so again, it's really not something that you want to take lightly. And that also can mean that you may decide that this is not the right time to take it, and that is okay. We look at students and the incoming classes year to year going into medical school. The average age of entering medical students is now 24, 25. You're seeing the first classes of starting medical classes tend to be students who've taken at least one or more bridge years. And so again, it's not that you have to stay on track at a specific timeline. Professional schools and medical schools are looking for you to apply when it's the best time, and taking the MCAT when is the best time for you may mean that you might need to consider a little bit more time just to make sure that you take it once and you can do well with it versus taking the test once and then having to think about going through the whole process again.
That's great. Definitely taking the exam when you feel ready and prepared is certainly a very key takeaway. So thank you to our panelists for their great thoughts for some of our prepared questions. We're going to move into the Q&A section, but I do just want to highlight that the AAMC does make free and low-cost resources available to help you at every stage of your preparation. And you've heard about some of those resources today from our panelists. I just want to highlight that some of our free resources include the complete content outline of the exam, so you can see all of the concepts and skills that you'll be tested on for the test day. We also, as I mentioned, have a guide to creating a study plan. This will help you figure out in 6 different steps how to develop your own. Again, we have those profiles of 21 different students about their the ways that they prepared for the exam, lessons that they learned, their schedules, and as I mentioned, Daquan is one of those students that we've highlighted, so be sure to check that out. And finally, as Carol mentioned, we do have the Khan Academy MCAT collection. This has 1,100 videos and 3,000 review questions that are all free, that are all on the Khan Academy website. And it was done through a collaboration with Khan, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the AAMC, so that will have content that's specific to the MCAT exam. And finally, we do have low-cost test preparation resources, including full-length practice exams, question sets that give you a sense of, that have been written by the test developers and give you a sense of what the test day experience will be like. And again, there are lots of other resources out there at your disposal. Don't forget about your class notes, the library, study groups, other forums and resources out there, and some of those have been highlighted throughout this presentation as well. So with that, we have noticed that there have been lots of questions, great questions submitted. So we're just going to dive right in, and let's start with before we jump into that, there was a question about the NAHP website for help with a pre-health advisor if you don't have one or you are no longer in undergrad and can't access a pre-health advisor. And that website is naahp.org. So let's dive into those questions. So let's start with some of the most common study mistakes. Carol, I don't know if you want to start us off.
I think two come to mind, and my colleagues may add to that or disagree with me, but I think one common mistake is to think that somebody else who told you how they did it is the best way for you to decide how you should do it. It goes back to what Daquan was saying. You really have to know yourself and your learning style and what's going to work for you and develop a plan that makes sense for you, even if it's different from what the guy down the hall said or your older sister said. The other thing, even though I'm not a big fan of studying too long and way in advance, I think students sometimes wait too long to really take a look at what this test is about and figure out that it's going to take a chunk of time, like Francisco said, a whole course worth of time to prepare for it, and they start too late.
Great. Anyone else have any comments on that?
I think I would just add that the practice tests become a very critical piece because that is a true indicator of how you're doing. And so oftentimes students will take one practice test and then they'll take a second one, and if they're comfortable with those scores, they think that they are ready. And it really is, again, putting in the time to put in that training so that you can feel comfortable about the score. And what I'm seeing is doing more than 7, 8, or 9 full practice tests is going to start giving you a true sense of where you are testing and are you comfortable with that score, and to evaluate those scores to decide if you are ready to take it at that point.
And I'd like to piggyback on that as well, that practice tests, I think one of the key things that many of my friends and I, when we took the exams, that we all did consistently when we took our practice exams, is we made it almost identical to our real test day. That means we started at the same time in the morning that our exam would actually start, and we took probably the same snacks that we probably would take, and also just to get a feeling of what it would be like on test day to really take the exam. Other distractions, being in a quiet space, because again, if you can get into like a habit where it feels familiar, you'll have a much better idea in terms of how you'll actually perform versus being a one-off event that you're training for.
That's great. Thank you. Another question that we received was an advice for a student who may be taking the exam for the second time or maybe a third time. What would you recommend for the student in their preparation? Francisco, would you want to start us off?
Yeah. The reality is that you want to increase your score, and so you have to go back and evaluate how did you prepare for it and what are you going to do differently, because most times if you go back and do the exact same process, you'll probably end up with a very similar score. And I remind students that every test take or score that you have will be seen by every medical school that you apply to, so they'll see the whole history of all the different exams that you've taken, even if the tests have expired or the shelf life has already passed on them. And so the first thing is to evaluate what is it that you're going to do different. And the second thing is evaluate what are the mistakes that you're doing in your test taking. Is it a content, you don't know the content as well, and you need to go back and really know the material. Oftentimes students may take the test without having completed all the prereq courses, all the main courses that are critical and content covered in the actual test. Or is it more of a strategies thing? And so again, working with resources to help you identify what are your strategies, are there ways that you can improve that? And then again, the multiple practice test is going to be the way that to truly know how prepared you are for it. And so, oftentimes there's a pressure of having to take it really quickly again because they want to meet the timeline to submit an application and still be early in the application timeline. And from my perspective, that's a lot of pressure, and oftentimes they may not result in the score that you want. And so again, taking a step back, learning from the experience, taking the time to make mature and smart decisions, this is what the medical schools are looking at. They get to see the dates and times that you took this test. So when they see a quick turnaround and they see a lower score or a score that's equal, they can say, okay, we can kind of guess what happened here. So again, this is a process that you're along the way in different ways. You're showing to professional schools that you have this level of maturity, that this is something that you are serious about, and you are going to commit the time to make sure that you change things and do things right the second time around.
Thanks, Francisco. Carol or Daquan, do you have any? Well, Daquan, you haven't taken it again, but Carol, do you have any?
Yeah, I actually would have said much of the same things that Francisco said. When a student comes in, the first thing I ask them is, reflecting back on how you prepared the first time, what worked, but what didn't work? What would you do differently? What's your new study plan going to be? And earlier, Francisco had said, if you don't feel like you're prepared, you shouldn't take the test. You shouldn't automatically assume that you can prepare to retake and do better in 2 or 3 months just because you want to apply to med school this cycle. That may not make sense. You may need more time to do a good job, and waiting for the following cycle may be the smartest move you can make. So you want to be open-minded about your timeline and focus rather on what are the steps I can take and what is the time that I need to do a good job and improve my score the next time around.
Great, thank you. We have a question here about dealing with study burnout. Daquan, did you experience any of this, or Carol and Francisco, do you have any suggestions for a student to deal with that?
So yes, it's a very real thing. I think it comes from just the fact that, like, as medical students or students aspiring to become physicians, we're very ambitious, we're very motivated, and which is why I wound up doing the smaller chunks per day. So at a certain point, you do feel like you're tired and you don't want to study anymore. And that's why it's important to have balance. That's why it's important to have a schedule. So I made sure to keep things that I enjoy doing in my schedule. So I didn't let studying take over my entire life. I'm a musician by training, and so I really enjoy playing the piano. So it means I made sure that every day after I finished studying, I got a chance to play my piano for a little bit. So that way it kind of paired the studying with something that's relaxing, something that I enjoyed. And I did notice when I started taking that a little bit too far, I would start feeling burnout, feeling exhausted, feeling more tired. And then when I realized I put those things back in, it made it a lot more easy to stick with my schedule long term. So it's important to make sure that the schedules are important, that you schedule enough time for you to study, but then also keeping in some things to keep you healthy, both emotionally and physically.
I couldn't agree more.
Yep. What I jump into is and say that it really depends on the student, but I don't typically recommend doing 8 hours preparation for the MCAT per day. You want to find balance. You want to find an opportunity to take breaks, and again just be able to think about it as a long-term preparation. And so sometimes I'll see students say, yeah, I'm gonna take the next month, I'm going to study 8 hours a day, and then 4 or 5 hours during the weekend, and that's a really quick way to get burned out right away. So again, switching things up, learning things in different ways. There's a lot of great resources online. Videos can be a different way to learn and review materials. Talking things out with other people, learning from each other can be other ways that you're practicing and preparing and learning content as well, and switching it up. And again, keeping an eye on other aspects. I have some students who actually, just like Daquan mentioned, is they start preparing and simulating parts of the test itself, waking up at a certain time, being for sure to know where they're going and understanding what their day is going to look like. I actually had a student that one time actually woke up, drove to the site, knew exactly where they were going to park, and kind of simulate every single step all the way to the start of the test. And so that was even part of the end of the prep that he did. But also have fun. Try to identify resources, support systems. If you're non-traditional, yes, it can be very tough to do things alone, and so that becomes very important to find out, are there other a community that you can tap into? Finding a mentor. Sometimes it's simply finding a physician or someone that you can shadow that may not be helping you prepare for the test, but again, reminding you why you're doing this, why you're putting this effort and time and what you're committed to. And so support comes in a lot of different ways, and in essence, that could also sometimes have a bigger impact at points.
That's great. Thank you. We got a question here about doing a post-bac program as a way to prepare for the MCAT exam. Carol and Francisco, do you have any thoughts on that? Carol, would you maybe want to start?
Yeah, I would like to jump in because I run a post-bac program and say absolutely it is not worth doing a post-bac program to prepare for the MCAT. You should not be coming to my program or any other program and spending money for the program just to prepare for the MCAT. The programs are designed to give you coursework that you either haven't had or you had coursework as an undergrad, you didn't do so well, and you need to strengthen your academic record by redoing courses or doing some additional courses and getting good grades. You should not need a program like that to prepare for the MCAT. If you feel like you need a formal structure in a classroom setting to prepare for the MCAT, there are commercial review courses out there, and while they are expensive, they're a lot less expensive than a post-bac program. So I don't think a post-bac program makes sense for that.
I would concur, and just have them really evaluate what is it they're trying to get out of that post-bac program, and does it match their true goal. And if it's for the MCAT, I have not seen, unless the post-bac program is actually incorporating some MCAT prep component, which could be a course, it could be other support systems. They incorporate an element of it, but it's not, I have yet to see a post-bac program that is just for the sole purpose of preparing for the MCAT.
Right.
Thank you for that. We got a question here about advice for students who've been studying for a long time but still are finding it hard to reach their desired score, a score that they feel is competitive for them. Francisco or Carol, do you have any thoughts on how a student might get past that?
I would recommend switching things up, doing things differently, and again, looking at more time doesn't necessarily mean higher score. So if you've hit a point where you're consistently scoring the same location, that's an indicator that you've kind of maxed out on that strategy. And so looking at what other strategies and identifying new strategies. It's interesting because you could always look at on your campus, you might have an academic success office. You might actually looking at counseling centers that work with like anxiety and relaxation prep and those type of things. So again, finding other things that you can do that could potentially open up the window for more growth to happen.
Great.
Yeah. The other thing I might consider, and this is a tougher thing to think about, I would first do what Francisco said, but it may be that your academic foundation isn't that strong or isn't strong enough. I sometimes have students who are trying to take the MCAT before they've taken all the core courses, which to me is always a mistake. But even if you've had the core courses, maybe you don't have as much in-depth understanding of those topics, and it would be helpful to give yourself another year when you're going to be taking perhaps some more science courses or some behavioral science courses, just so you have a stronger foundation before you even attack the studying for the MCAT, because the MCAT assumes that you've learned material before you sit down to prepare for the test. So that is something for the student to consider as well.
That's great.
From a
Thank you.
student's perspective, though, I think there's two aspects to the exam. There's the content piece, and then the other aspect is the standardized exam piece. And as I mentioned before, that the MCAT, yes, it tests content, but you also have to be a decent test taker to get through medical school because we're tested consistently. And then we get more standardized exams in the form of STEP. And then even as a professional, you get recertified every 10 years. So these exams never go away. So you have to understand whether or not is this a test-taking problem or is this a content problem. So really get into the root of the problem to kind of assess what you should be doing moving forward. And if it's a test-taking problem, you can probably look for neuropsych evaluations or things like that to see whether or not you might have an undiagnosed learning disability, and it just may have gone undiagnosed for a while because you're a high achiever. And it could be something that could help you figure out more in terms of revamping your study style. because I've seen that happen with some of my medical school classmates. And it's a really important aspect for you to stay certified and actually do what you love to do. So that's one thing that I think about from the student's perspective. That could be a key role to think about.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Going along with kind of understanding your learning style, we've gotten a couple questions around how do you sort of develop that, or how do you know what the best learning style is. And there's a question here about how do you review practice exams after you take them. And I think this is one great way to learn kind of what you've done, what you haven't understood or what you didn't get right. And I was wondering if, Daquan, from your perspective, did you use exams to review, and how did you go about doing that so in an effective way?
Absolutely. Reviewing exams is probably the biggest part in terms of, one, setting up my study schedule, and then two, in terms of trying to figure out what did I miss in that question. And because the MCAT is all free response, you have to think about it and approach the question in terms of, well, do I, one, understand what the question's asking me? And then two, why is the correct answer correct and why are the other ones wrong? If you can't convince yourself and tell yourself why those other answer choices are wrong, then there's something you're missing. It's more than just knowing the right answer, but knowing why the other ones are wrong. And so the way I went through that was I went through each question, even the questions I got correct, and I made sure to note the ones, even the ones I guessed on, making sure that, well, why did I have to guess on this question? Which of these answer choices tripped me up? Why was I picking between one or two questions, one or two answer choices? And it's super time consuming, but it's well worth it, because then you have a deeper understanding of the fact that, did I miss the content? Did I misread the question because of stress? Or is this something that I just didn't cover in my coursework yet? And this is something I have to fill in, supplement, and find somewhere else. And so it's super beneficial, super time consuming, but you're going through each question, you're reading the question, making sure you get what it's asking you, and then making sure you understand why each of the answer choices are given there, and what are the ones that are more tricky questions. And so, yeah, I literally did that for my first exam. When I took the diagnostic one, I did that for all 100-plus questions. And it took me about a week to go through all of those questions and several hours per day just to get through all of them and try to figure out what was that thought process.
Great. Thank you for sharing. Let's see about another question. We have a question here about what's the best way to create a study schedule? We've mentioned one resource, but are there tools that Daquan, you use when developing your study schedule, or Carol and Francisco, you recommend to your students?
Well, I can start really quick. I didn't particularly use a tool. I think one of the benefits I had from being a really strong student in undergrad was that I understood my study style and I also understood my schedule. So when I was studying, the reason why I took 8 months is because most of my semesters were between 22 and 24 credits per semester. So I'm always taking between 6 and 9 courses. And so that means for me to study 4 hours every day just for a semester wouldn't have been sufficient, because I could only devote 2 hours per day because of my other classes and coursework. So for me, I understood what my schedule looked like. I understood my learning style. And so from that, I could figure out where in my schedule I can put things for consistency to make it a little bit easier for me to keep up with. And so that came with just using Google Calendar and having that remind me every time when did I have to do things, which was already part of my schedule anyway. So I use Google Calendar as one of those key tools so that I can visually see when things are happening, when they have to happen, and it's also having those cues just remind you, because you do forget from time to time.
Thank you. Carol or Francisco, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I've already mentioned I refer students a lot to the scheduling tool that the AAMC has on their MCAT website. We also, as Francisco mentioned it for his school, our school has an academic resource center, and we have consultants who work with students on study skills and scheduling their time and managing their time. So if I had a student who really felt like they needed more support, I might refer them to our academic resource center to help them set up a study plan.
Great. Thank you. So maybe have time for maybe one or two more questions. We have a question here about strategies for students that are actually working full-time. Do you have any suggestions for how they can work in preparing for test day? Carol or Francisco? Carol?
I have a lot of alums who apply to medical school. We have a somewhat older average applicant pool here, so a fair percentage of my students are working when they're studying for the MCAT, and I don't think it's that much different than what Daquan was saying. I mean, he was basically working full-time with all those courses he was taking. You just have to create a schedule. You have to know that when you get home from work at night, you're going to devote X number of hours, whatever those hours are, whatever schedule you've set up for yourself. I usually suggest to students that they not schedule in every night for studying, just like you can't go lift weights at the gym every day. You need to give your muscles a break once in a while, but you need a schedule, and you need to say, is it effective for me to go home from work to study, or is it smarter if I grab something to eat and go to the local library to study because it's going to be more effective, and then when I go home I can relax. So again, it's all about a schedule, and in some ways it may seem harder if you're working full-time, but I'm not sure it necessarily is, depending on what your course load is like when you're a student.
Yeah, thanks, Carol, because that's kind of what I was thinking, is that what I typically see is that the students who are in courses have a harder time because not only are they in class most of the day, but then they have to balance studying outside of class time, and that leads into the evening hours, where someone who may be working might have the ability to have a little bit better structure, where they know that at work they don't have to worry about preparing for the MCAT or trying to squeeze an hour here and there between classes, but rather focus on your work so that you don't bring work home. And then your afternoons and evenings, your evenings and weekends are your time. So as long as you're managing your time well, typically I would say, 2 to 3. Sometimes some people can do 4 hours a night. 3 times a week can be reasonable. Maybe 4 times a week, depending if you have weekend time available. And then just being aware that the full practice test, you want to mimic the full test. You don't want to do just half of it. That will take, 7.5 hours, as we saw earlier. And so, being able to build in those days on your weekends to do full practice tests is pretty much the bigger picture of what you're trying to build in together. And so I think sometimes we put on stigmas on ourselves of thinking that we're in a worse off position, but, again, oftentimes our own situation might actually be better to help us create a better structure. And when it's time to play, it's time to play, but when it's time to work, it's time to work. So being able to see your situation as a positive one and work with what you got, and it is doable.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that is all the time that we have today for all of your great questions. If we didn't get to your question during this presentation, we do want to let you know that the AAMC is available throughout the day till 8 p.m. During the virtual fair. The medical schools are here to chat with you, and some of the pre-health advisors are here as well. So please be sure to direct your questions throughout the day. We hope you enjoyed this presentation, you found it useful, and again, I want to just extend my thanks for Carol, Francisco, and Daquan for taking the time to speak with all of us today and to offer their great insights and advice. So again, thank you, and thank you to everyone who is listening today. We hope you have a great rest of your fair.
Thank you so much
and
for the opportunity.
Good luck to everyone.
Good luck to everyone.
Good luck.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.